He could maneuver billion-dollar deals with a single phone call, yet couldn't persuade his son to take even one bite. Richard Hayes sat upright in his Italian suit, shoulders stiff, the pale golden glow from the crystal chandeliers of the Wexford grill casting a hard, stone-cold light across his face. In front of him, Oliver, just 8 years old, curled into the velvet chair, his body swaying to some secret rhythm only he could hear. The expensive lobster, still steaming when it was first served, now lay untouched, cooling under the watchful stares of other diners. In that opulent room, the clinking of cutlery against porcelain rang crisp and bright, laughter threaded with the scent of fine wine. Yet among all that splendor, Richard's table became the center of attention. From nearby seats, whispers reached his ears. What's wrong with the boy? Sitting before such a meal and not touching it. Doesn't know how to raise his child. Each murmur pierced his chest like a needle. Richard was used to reverent eyes in the boardroom, used to absolute silence when he spoke. But here, everything was different. Scrutinizing glances, muted laughter, whispers with no attempt at concealment. He leaned closer to his son, voice low and gravelly, forcing out every word. Oliver, please. Everyone is watching. But Oliver didn't respond. He kept rocking, fingers drumming out a rhythm on the table, his bright eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. Richard's world of power, of success, of monumental deals had no place in his son's. Richard tugged at his tie, the habitual gesture he always made before major signings. But tonight, confidence didn't come with it. He felt as if he were sitting in the hot seat, under dozens of probing eyes, without a single strategy to shift the moment. Oliver, a boy who lived in a 17-room mansion with every luxury imaginable, found his only peace in this chair, in the comfort of his familiar sway, in a private sky no one else could reach. And Richard, the father, once hailed as a master of control, now had no key to unlock the door into his child's world. The glittering chandeliers, the gleaming wine glasses, the impeccable suits, everything dissolved into a backdrop for a bitter truth. A man who could hold power over life and death in his hands stood powerless before his little boy. Richard sat frozen in the leather chair, his eyes following every steady sway of Oliver's body. The boy kept drumming his fingers on the table, his small shoulders trembling as if pulled into an invisible melody no adult could hear. For a brief moment, the entire room grew silent. Then soft laughter rippled again. Sweat beaded across Richard's brow, his heart pounding harder than it ever did in front of hundreds of shareholders. And then, a figure appeared. Danielle Brooks, the waitress in a spotless white apron, walked toward their table. Her steps were feather-light, deliberately softened so as not to startle the boy. Richard looked up, brows furrowing. He meant to wave her off, to tell her to leave it alone. But Danielle said nothing. She bent down on one knee, lowering herself to Oliver's eye level, not towering over him the way most adults did, but bringing her world down so it met his. Richard caught the surprised glances from nearby tables, heard fresh whispers rising. Danielle didn't seem to notice. And then, a gentle sound filled the air. She began to hum, soft and tender, the familiar tune of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. She didn't sing loud enough for the room. Only a murmur, just sufficient for Oliver. Strangely, her rhythm matched perfectly with the boy's swaying. Richard leaned forward. He didn't understand what was happening. Oliver paused for half a second, then swayed again. Danielle kept humming, keeping the rhythm as if she had tapped into his secret language. Slowly, she picked up a small piece of lobster from the plate, holding it delicately between her fingers. She didn't push it toward his mouth the way therapists had tried before. Instead, she let the morsel trace slow circles in the air, imitating the very patterns Oliver had been drawing on the table. The lobster became a tiny dancer, turning gracefully in time with her song. Danielle repeated the motion, patient, her gaze soft and unwavering. And then, the impossible happened. Oliver stopped, his little shoulders stilled, his drumming fingers froze. The eyes that so often avoided others began to lift inch by inch, until they met Danielle's. They lingered there, in the deep well of her patient eyes, as though for the first time, Oliver realized someone had truly stepped into his world. Richard held his breath. He hardly dared move, fearing a single blink might shatter the fragile moment. Danielle kept humming. Slowly, she guided the lobster closer, not rushing, not commanding, but leaving the choice to him. And at last, as if by magic, Oliver leaned forward. His small lips parted. The morsel disappeared. Oliver began to chew. Richard was stunned. For 2 years, teams of specialists with every method, behavioral therapy, speech programs, medication had failed. Yet here, in a glittering restaurant, a waitress had done in minutes what none of them could. Oliver swallowed, then opened his mouth again. Danielle continued, keeping the rhythm, turning food into a playful experience. The boy ate again. Then again, each small movement reaching. In chewing, swallowing was nothing less than a miracle in Richard's eyes. The room remained noisy, but to Richard, it all fell away into a distant hum. Before him was only his son, calmly eating, and the stranger who had somehow entered a world no one else could reach. He sat in stunned silence. One question echoed louder than all the whispers around him. Who is she? And how had she done what an entire team of experts could not? 3 days before that night at the Wexford Grill, Richard Hayes stood in his office on the 60th floor of the glass tower that bore his company's name. From here, the city stretched out below like a giant chessboard. Buildings lined up like orderly pieces. The light from thousands of windows shimmered against the glass, creating a glittering sea of brilliance. To Richard, it was more than a view. It was proof of the power he held in his hands. On the polished walnut desk, the phone rang in short bursts. Each call had the power to sway a corporation's stock price, to alter the fate of thousands of employees. He was used to this feeling control. Command, decision. To him, such things came as easily as breathing. The door eased open. His secretary entered, voice low and respectful. Sir, the car is ready for your dinner with Oliver. Richard frowned faintly. He gave a brief nod, his eyes still fixed on the thick financial report. In his mind, dinner with his son was not a joy or anticipation. It was an obligation. Another item to be checked off, a crowded calendar. He loved his boy. At least he told himself so. But he had no idea how to reach him. Every meeting ended in silence, in tension, in a widening distance. That distance had roots. It traced back to the choices Richard once made, to the path he had taken to become the Richard Hayes of today. 5 years earlier, in the grand boardroom, the projection screen displayed the profit report. Red numbers glared under the category. Special education program. A department director spoke cautiously. Sir, the special needs programs are driving up costs. The revenue barely offsets the spending. If we continue, we'll lose the advantage against competitors. Richard leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled at his chest. His voice rang out, firm and absolute. Cut. The room fell silent. The director stammered. But this division has a significant social impact. Many parents trust us. Richard cut him off, voice cold. Not profitable. We focus our resources on the core sectors, general health care, mainstream education, and technology. What brings revenue? The rest, unnecessary. Glances darted across the table, a few hesitant looks. But in the end, all nodded. Richard's word was law. The decision was written into the minutes within minutes. No one in that room thought of the hundreds of children losing the only place that welcomed them. And Richard, as he signed the cut order, never imagined that years later, his son would need those very programs. 2 years earlier, the clinic was awash in sterile white light. Richard sat across from the doctor, his hands gripping his knees tightly. The doctor spoke in a calm, measured tone, yet every word fell on Richard's ears, heavy as stone. Your son falls on the autism spectrum. This is not a death sentence, but it will change your family's life. The words made Richard's chest cave. Autism. The word echoed in his mind like a blade's strike. He had read it, seen it in the company's medical reports, but never thought it would touch his blood. The doctor went on. Oliver needs early intervention programs. There are excellent centers that help children communicate, ease sensory strain, and find their language. But, he paused, a shadow crossing his eyes. In recent years, many programs lost funding. Resources are limited. It will be difficult to find the right place. Richard froze. Lost funding. The phrase struck like a hammer to his memory. He had signed those cuts, without hesitation. Back then, it was only numbers on a report. Now, that signature had become a wall blocking him from his son. But the tragedy went deeper, down to the roots of Richard's life. Before he became the powerful CEO, Richard himself had once been a boy who didn't fit. As a child, he struggled to play with peers. He liked sitting alone for hours, reading, stacking wooden blocks into strange shapes. Noise overwhelmed him. The crowds made it hard to breathe. Adults called him the odd child. No one believed he could grow up to lead an empire. But Richard chose to bury it all. He trained himself to speak less of feelings, to hide his sensitivity behind a cold exterior. Each time he was mocked, he added another brick to the wall around his heart. Little by little, he learned to become the perfect man in the eyes of others, until the wall grew so high that even he forgot the sensitive boy within. Now, when he looked at Oliver, those small shoulders rocking, those eyes avoiding the world, Richard saw himself reflected there. A mirror image. A buried memory comes alive, and he realized the very defenses he had built to survive were now chains binding his son. 3 days earlier, from that 60th floor office, Richard looked down at the city, telling himself he stood at the height of power. But deep within, he knew, to Oliver, he was only a father lost, without a map to find the way into his child's small, fragile world. 13 years earlier, Danielle Brooks walked into the small classroom of Riverside Learning Center with a radiant smile. The room was cramped, the desks worn, the posters on the walls peeling at the corners. Yet to her, it was sacred ground. Here, there were no broken children. Here, every student was a star waiting only for the right way to shine. "Remember this," she often told her assistant, her voice soft but steady. "These kids aren't wrong. They just speak a different language. Our job is to learn that language." And she lived that belief fully. Every day, Danielle knelt on the floor, building Lego towers with trembling little hands. She hummed softly to soothe meltdowns triggered by loud noises. She folded paper again and again, dozens of times, just to see the spark in a child's eyes when at last they managed it on their own. That was the reward, not the modest paycheck, but the miraculous moment when a child's world opened before her. In those years, Danielle believed education could change lives. She believed that with enough love and patience, every door could open. But over time, financial reports crept into the classroom. 5 years ago, the center received notice of funding cuts. Without new resources, Riverside would have to close. That night, Danielle sat alone in the teacher's office. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, and stacks of papers rose around her. On the desk lay the letter she had written herself. An appeal sent to Hayes Global, the corporation renowned for its investments in education. She wrote with all her faith that these children deserved a chance, that with support, they would grow into capable citizens. "Please see them as whole human beings," Danielle typed, her hands trembling but her eyes bright. The letter left her desk, sent off like a final prayer. In a high-rise office just blocks away, Richard Hayes signed a paper with his usual, practiced motion. A short, decisive signature, declined. To him, it was nothing more than an inefficient expense. He never remembered it. But for Danielle, it was a fatal cut. Weeks later, Riverside Learning Center closed its doors. The children scattered, parents bewildered, teachers weeping. Danielle stood in the empty classroom, staring at the silent desks, her heart twisting. Years of devotion, of dreams, dissolved into smoke, all because of a single cold decision made far above. With no job and no place to belong, she was forced to survive. Her teaching applications went unanswered. Nowhere had the budget been left for special programs. Danielle folded away her master's degree in special education from Columbia, tucked it into a drawer, then put on a white apron and stepped into the Wexford Grill. From the teacher who had once opened doors for hundreds of children, she became the server carrying expensive plates for the elite. The hands that once guided small fingers to write letters now grew calloused from balancing trays. Each night after her shift, she looked into the cracked mirror of the staff room, whispering to herself, "This is only temporary. My heart is still the same." And it was true. That heart never changed. Each time she saw a child in the restaurant, Danielle instinctively softened her voice, slowed her step, careful not to startle them. Each time she heard a lonely cry, she knelt to eye level, patient as ever. People said it was just an old habit, but to Danielle, it was instinct, an unextinguished love. She carried a wound, abandoned by the system, stripped of the educational home she had built with all her heart. But with that wound, she still carried a flame, the conviction that children with differences deserved to be seen, deserved to be loved, even if the world turned away. And it was that very flame which, 5 years later, lit up the small boy swaying in a velvet chair at the Wexford Grill. In the days following that fateful evening, Richard Hayes began to change his habits. Once, he had avoided meals with Oliver, seeing them as suffocating hours with no escape. But now, it was Richard who took the initiative. Every night, the sleek black Mercedes pulled up in front of the Wexford Grill. The staff grew accustomed to the sight of the powerful CEO and his light brown-haired son, entering with quiet reserve. And without asking, Richard always chose the same spot, the secluded corner table where Danielle Brooks worked. At first, he told himself it was because Oliver would only eat when Danielle was present. But the truth was, Richard himself breathed easier when she was there. Amid the curious glances of diners, she alone created a pocket of calm, a fragile bubble that shielded father and son. Danielle was more than a server. Quietly, almost invisibly, she became a teacher, not with lectures or authority, but with small, almost imperceptible instructions. One evening, as Richard leaned close to his son, the glow of his phone screen reflected sharply across Oliver's face, making the boy flinch and cover his eyes. Danielle laid a gentle hand on his wrist and whispered, "Lower the brightness. Flickering light hurts him." Richard froze, unsettled. He had never thought such a thing mattered. But when he dimmed the screen, Oliver lowered his hands, his small shoulders easing just a little. Such a small change, yet to Richard, it felt like a door opening. Another time, as he tried to coax Oliver, his voice turned harsh, steeped in the command he used in boardrooms. "You need to eat. Do you hear me?" Danielle shook her head softly. Her voice was like a breeze, lower, slower. To a sensitive child, loud voices sound like thunder. Richard tried. His tone softened, slowed. To his surprise, Oliver didn't cover his ears or bolt away. The boy still didn't respond, but he no longer recoiled. On another evening, Richard sat directly across from Oliver, trying to force eye contact. The boy twisted away, agitated. Danielle approached quietly, not head-on. "Come from the side. Less pressure." Richard obeyed, sitting beside his son. He noticed Oliver wasn't as tense. The boy still rocked, still drummed his fingers, but he no longer pulled away. For the first time, Richard felt he occupied a place, however small, inside his son's world. These tiny cues, seemingly trivial, became a secret dictionary. Richard committed each one to memory, as if learning a new language, a language he had never thought he would need, the language of his child. Every night, he watched Danielle and Oliver, the way she waited, patient and unhurried, the way she turned meals into play, transforming a piece of lobster or mashed potato into dancing characters. And astonishingly, Oliver responded, not with words, but with his eyes, and with the simple act of opening his mouth for another bite. Richard began to realize, all these years, he had never truly seen his son. He had looked at Oliver through the lens of a CEO seeking to control, to fix, but Oliver did not need fixing. He only needed to be understood. One evening, as they were leaving, Richard murmured to Danielle, his voice caught between gratitude and awkwardness, "You're very good with him. Where did you learn this?" Danielle smiled gently, answering simply, "Practice and listening." Richard rode home in silence. In his mind, her words echoed like a persistent refrain, listening. From a man who had lived by command, he was learning to slow down, to lower his voice, to notice the small details he once dismissed as meaningless. He was slowly learning to see Oliver not as a difficult child, not as a burden, but as a soul waiting to be heard. And with each evening at that table, the wall inside Richard's heart cracked a little more. It didn't take long for the story to leak. One evening, as Richard and Oliver sat in their familiar corner at the Wexford Grill, a flash went off from across the room. Then another. In an instant, The restaurant was awash in the furtive glow of cameras. By the next morning, tabloids were splashed with sensational headlines. Millionaire CEO and the mysterious waitress. Richard Hayes, helpless father, seeking comfort in another's hands. The photos spread with dizzying speed. There was Richard, impeccably dressed, seated beside his swaying son, and a young woman leaning down with gentle care. The media didn't care who Danielle was. To them, 3 words were enough. The waitress. That alone spun the narrative. Editorials hurled criticism. A good father would never let his child become a public spectacle. A responsible CEO would not involve a restaurant employee in caregiving. Online, cruel comments multiplied. Unfit father. A man undeserving of his child. In the gleaming boardrooms of Hayes Global, shareholders murmured. To them, image was everything. A CEO mired in a family scandal could rattle the market's trust. Richard was accustomed to corporate battles, but with his private life ripped open for the world. He felt stripped bare, breathless under the scrutiny. And then, Margaret appeared. From a luxury apartment on the California coast, she sat before her screen, staring at the circulating photos. The woman who had left 2 years earlier when Oliver was first diagnosed, now faced the past, returning like a storm. When she walked away, she had clung to a fragile belief that she wasn't strong enough, that the weight was too heavy, that Richard, with all his power and wealth, could handle their son's care. But now, seeing the images, reading the sneers, only one feeling remained: guilt. Margaret didn't just see a man, a boy, and a waitress. She saw a broken family, and her hand in its fracture. Within days, Margaret contacted an attorney. The case was prepared swiftly. The father is unfit. The environment is inappropriate. The child is being exploited for questionable relationships. The language was cold, but beneath it lay torment. Because deep down, Margaret knew Oliver wasn't just a responsibility. He was the piece of her heart she had abandoned. In the stillness of nights, when every light was out, she remembered her son rocking by the window, remembered the steady tapping, remembered the eyes that turned from every gaze. In those moments, she had panicked, felt powerless, and fled. Now, the guilt crushed her. Richard received the notice from his lawyer on a rainy morning. He read each line, his hands trembling for the first time in years. Margaret, the woman he once shared a life with, the one who had left, was now back, armed with a custody petition. In the silence of his office, Richard collapsed into his chair. He thought of Oliver the night before, calmly eating under Danielle's patient guidance. Then he thought of the camera flashes, the whispers, and now, the lawsuit. A battle Richard had never imagined facing, not in the boardroom, but in the courtroom, was beginning, and this time, his opponent was not a corporate rival, but the very woman who once shared his life, carrying the same blood as the boy between them. That evening, the Wexford Grill was quieter than usual. Candlelight shimmered across the dark wood tables, and the piano music drifted softly, subdued and tender. Richard sat still, his eyes fixed on Oliver. The boy still rocked in his familiar rhythm, but something about it felt gentler, as if the waves inside him were beginning to calm. Danielle approached, placing before him a plate of food, already cut into small pieces. She didn't push, she didn't command. She simply sat beside him, offering a peaceful smile. Richard glanced at her, feeling a strange sense of safety whenever she was near. For weeks now, mealtimes had only found completeness with Danielle at the table. Oliver quietly tapped his fingers against the wood. Richard cleared his throat, about to remind him, but Danielle only shook her head slightly, signaling him to wait. She began to hum Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. That melody had calmed Oliver many times before, and now it did again. His small shoulders eased, his gaze softened. Danielle lifted a small piece of food, let it spin gently in the air, then set it onto a spoon. Oliver's eyes followed, slowly tracing its movement. Then suddenly, his small hand reached out, not to swat it away, not to push it back, but to touch Danielle's hand. Richard froze. His heart seemed to stop. In that hush, the unthinkable happened. Oliver's lips trembled, and then a voice broke free, hoarse, shaky from years of silence. "Mama Danielle." Hungry. The simple, halting words struck like lightning through the room. Danielle froze. Eyes brimming with tears, she covered her mouth. But the sob broke through, spilling down her cheeks. Richard's throat tightened. His hands clasped together beneath the table. For 2 years, he had not heard his son speak. 2 years of nothing but silence, rocking, tapping, and now, in the tenderness of the woman he once dismissed as just a waitress, his son had chosen to call her mama, not the therapists, not the specialists paid thousands an hour. Danielle, through patience and unconditional love, had reached the hidden place where Oliver lived. Danielle bent closer, placing her hand gently over his small one, her voice breaking. "You're hungry, Oliver. All right, let me help you." The boy nodded just slightly, yet that small gesture carried the force of an earthquake. It was proof that Oliver had never been lost. He had only been waiting for someone to step into his world. Richard sat there, chest aching. Through eyes blurred with tears, he saw the truth. All the wealth, all the power could never buy this moment. Only love, only connection could unlock the silence of his son. And in that instant, he knew his life would never be the same. The courtroom was packed. The gallery overflowed with reporters, cameras flashing in bursts like a storm of light. The name Richard Hayes had long been tied to business headlines. But today, it appeared in an entirely different context. A father standing before the court, fighting for custody of his 8-year-old son. Margaret Collins sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed in an elegant gown, her blonde hair smoothed as though she'd stepped out of a magazine. But beneath the composed surface was a storm. She knew she entered not only as a mother, but as the woman who had walked away when her child needed her most. Her lawyer stepped forward, voice sharp and resonant, every word aimed at Danielle Brooks. "Your Honor, my client Mrs. Collins did not leave her family for lack of love, but because of an unsafe environment. Consider this, a fragile boy, diagnosed with autism, entrusted to a waitress, no credentials, no training, a stranger who exploits the trust of a child to insert herself into another family. Is this a healthy environment?" A murmur swept through the room. Cameras turned on Danielle, seated among the witnesses. Her face was calm, but her eyes lowered, her hands clenched together. The attorney pressed on, voice like a blade. "The child calls her Mama Danielle. What are we to make of this? A boy, confused about roles, calls a restaurant worker his mother. This is an intrusion, inappropriate at best, dangerous at worst." Richard gripped the armrest, every muscle tight. He longed to shout back, but his lawyer caught his arm, whispering, "Wait for your turn." And then the moment came. The judge called, "Danielle Brooks, please take the stand." The room hushed as she rose. Light caught her neatly tied black hair, her plain black dress that did nothing to hide her poise. Danielle walked with steady steps, though inside her heart pounded. She raised her hand for the oath, then sat. The opposing attorney struck immediately. "Miss Brooks, what is your current occupation?" "Waitress at the Wexford Grill." "Exactly. A waitress. Do you believe yourself qualified to care for a special needs child? Are you being paid for this?" Danielle lifted her gaze, calm and steady. "I'm not paid to care for Oliver. I do it because I love him." The room stirred. The attorney gave a cold laugh. "Love? A vague sentiment. Do you think kindness replaces expertise? What degree do you have that proves you understand special needs children?" Danielle drew a breath, her voice clear and unwavering. "I hold a master's in special education from Columbia University. For 8 years, I directed the Riverside Learning Center, where over 200 children with autism, ADHD, and other developmental challenges found their voices. I guided each child to communicate, to believe in themselves. I don't only have credentials, I have a life's work devoted to these children." The courtroom fell silent. Reporters lifted their heads, fingers flying over keyboards. Danielle went on, her voice ringing yet gentle. 5 years ago, when Riverside faced financial collapse, I wrote a letter to Hayes Global. I begged them to keep our program alive, because I believed those children deserved a chance. And the man who signed the rejection was Mr. Hayes himself. Richard went still, each word cut like a knife. He remembered that signature, swift, decisive, without hesitation. Then it had been nothing but a number on a report. Now it stood before him as a sentence on his son. Danielle turned to the judge, her voice steady, resolute. I don't need the title of mother. Oliver calls me Mama Danielle, not because I forced him, not because I sought to take anyone's place. He calls me that because I was the first to see him as a gift, not a burden. Her words echoed through the chamber. A reporter lowered his camera, eyes glistening. Richard bowed his head, his hands trembling. In her testimony, he saw Oliver saw the truth. For years, he had never truly seen his child. At the plaintiff's table, Margaret clutched her leather purse, her face pale. Danielle's words shredded the calm mask she wore. In her mind rose the memory, the morning she left, leaving her son silent in his room, eyes vacant. She had thought herself powerless, had believed fleeing was her only option. Now, hearing this, she knew the truth. She had abandoned him. Tears streamed down Margaret's cheeks. She lowered her head, one trembling hand shielding her face. For the first time since she walked away, she confronted her guilt without defense. On the stand, Danielle lowered her hands, drawing in a breath, her eyes unwavering. She wasn't here to win. She was here to speak the truth, that no child should ever be seen as a burden. In that moment, silence spread across the courtroom, and everyone understood. No report, no headline, could erase what was plain before them. Oliver had been loved with a love no price could ever buy. The verdict rang out in the hushed courtroom. Oliver Hayes will continue living with his father, under the condition of mandatory family therapy and enrollment in autism. Support programs under professional supervision. The gavel struck, sharp and final, closing weeks of relentless tension. Richard exhaled, as though released from a war fought on too many fronts. He gripped Oliver's small hand tightly, then lifted his eyes to Danielle. Her gaze met his tired, but shining with faith. Margaret rose slowly from the plaintiff's seat. Her steps were heavy as lead, but her heart weighed even more. In the hallway, she found Richard standing with Oliver and Danielle. For a moment, she nearly turned away, but something rooted her in place. Richard, her voice was hoarse. He turned, eyes wary. Margaret swallowed hard, then spoke, her voice trembling. I was wrong. Wrong to leave. Wrong to think I wasn't strong enough. I don't deserve anything back, but please, give me just one small chance. To be a mother, even if it's only during family therapy sessions. I want to be there. I need to learn how to stand beside Oliver from the beginning, the way I should have. Richard was silent. Years of bitterness rushed in. Nights spent alone with Oliver. The moments of abandonment. The battles he carried on his shoulders. But then he saw the sincerity of Margaret's tears. The way her hands trembled like a plea. He looked toward Danielle. Danielle gave a small nod. A nod not only for Margaret, but for Oliver. For the boy who deserved more than one chance to be loved. Richard let out a long breath, his voice low. All right, but this time, you have to truly be there. Margaret broke down, nodding through tears. When she left, Richard turned to Danielle. They stood in silence for a moment. No words needed. Then he spoke, his voice rough, stripped of command or pride. I'm sorry. Danielle blinked, caught off guard. He continued, I'm sorry for what my company did. That letter you wrote years ago, I signed the rejection. One cold signature destroyed the center you built, stole away the chance for hundreds of children. And now, I see it clearly. That very decision came back to steal from my son. His voice cracked, his eyes wet. I can't change the past, but I want to make it right. Danielle, I want you to lead the new fund, the Hayes Foundation for Neurodevelopmental Support. You'll have full authority, full budget. The vision will be yours. Rebuild what should never have been lost. Danielle was stunned. Memories flooded back. The classrooms of Riverside. The first time a child called her teacher. The spark in their eyes when they found their voices. Then the locked doors. The white apron. The broken dreams she had buried. She looked at Richard. Searching, she found no pity, no condescension. Only a father learning humility. A powerful man at last willing to listen. Finally, Danielle gave a small nod. All right, but not for you. For Oliver, and for every child who deserves to be seen. Richard smiled a rare smile, carrying release. For the first time, he felt the wound in his heart begin to heal. 6 months later, on a golden autumn morning, A new sign was raised over the red brick building that had once closed in silence. Hayes Foundation for Neurodevelopmental Support. It was the rebirth of the old Riverside Learning Center, renewed, brighter, but carrying the same spirit as the beginning. A home for children once labeled as different. Inside, wide windows opened to let sunlight flood the room, warming every corner. Danielle Brooks stood at the center of the new classroom, one hand over her chest, her eyes brimming with emotion. Around her, 15 children laughed and giggled, their voices rising like a pure melody. Each child carried a world of their own. Yet here, everyone was welcomed. Near the doorway stood Richard Hayes, his suit simple, stripped of the cold CEO aura that once made Wall Street tremble. Beside him was Oliver, 8 years old, his small shoulders dressed in a crisp white shirt. He no longer curled into himself with constant rocking. The moments of retreat still came. But today, Oliver walked calmly into the center of the room, where a brand new piano awaited. The room fell silent as he sat down, placing his small hands on the keys. Richard held his breath. Danielle gave him a gentle nod of encouragement. And then, the first notes emerged, the familiar melody Danielle had once hummed. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. But this time, it wasn't the teacher's voice. It was Oliver himself, letting music flow from his trembling hands, turning silence into language. The sound wavered, hesitant, uneven, but it was pure, clear, each note like a tiny star falling, lighting the room. Children stopped playing. Parents and teachers stilled. Only the crystalline music of the boy, who had been silent for 2 years, filled the air. When the final note lingered, the room remained suspended in awe, unwilling to break the miracle. Then suddenly, applause erupted, crashing like a wave. Tears streamed down faces. Danielle stood motionless, her hands trembling with emotion, while Richard's cheeks glistened with tears. Amid applause, Richard looked at his son, and for a moment, he saw himself as a child. The young Richard, sensitive, solitary, content to sit for hours listening to rhythms no one else could hear. The boy he had buried became the cold CEO. Now, through Oliver, that boy lived again, not dismissed as odd, but recognized as a soul with his language. Richard stepped forward, kneeling by the piano. He wrapped his arms around his son, voice breaking with raw emotion. "My boy, I hear you now. I truly hear you." Oliver didn't answer with words. He only looked up, smiling, his eyes shining like stars. In the back row, Margaret sat quietly. Tears slipped down her cheeks. But this time, they weren't only of regret. They were the tears of a mother beginning her path to redemption. She smiled through them, watching her son at the piano, silently vowing she would never run again. Even in a small role, she would stay, learning to listen. Danielle looked on, a child who had found his voice, a father rediscovering himself, a mother learning how to return. Her heart swelled with gratitude. For years, she had believed every child carried a language of their own. And today, that belief rang out in music. When the applause subsided, Danielle stepped forward, her voice soft yet steady. "Oliver has shown us the most important truth. Every child has a language of their own. We only need to listen." Once more, silence filled the room, not empty silence, but silence rich with meaning, where each person could hear the beating of their own heart. Outside the windows, the late sun poured golden light across the walls. Inside, Oliver set his hands back on the keys, beginning another melody. And this time, Richard needed no translation, no effort to understand. He simply sat there and listened. If you had been in that room when Oliver sat at the piano and let music speak in place of words, what would you have done? Would you have sat in silence, or wept like Richard when he finally heard his son's true language? We all carry such a moment when a loved one, a child, or even ourselves only needs someone to truly listen. Have you ever had such an experience? Share it in the comments below. Perhaps your story might become a light for someone else. And if you wish to keep walking alongside these human journeys, where the smallest gestures hold the power to change a life, follow American Stories.